I think I may have lost it. Not only have I, in the past 3 weeks, rebuilt my entire network at my house. I bought all new gear. We're going 2.5 gig, 10 gig for the backbone, all this. We went all in on new networking gear. I also reinstalled both my laptop and my desktop with NixOS. Not because I'm a fan of it, but because I wanted to try it and I maybe like some pain. And also, I've shifted my entire home lab over to Kubernetes, a technology that wouldn't exist with the guest on today's show. If you don't know Joe Beda, look him up. We're going to go through this history, a little bit brief of his history in technology in this episode. And it's just a fantastic look back at the last 20-ish years of what people have been doing that isn't necessarily what the state we're in today. And I love it as a reminder that technology in general is a lot bigger than a single technology you work on, and being able to shift your focus and try different things actually works out really well because you get a lot of difference in experiences and just understanding how the pieces might fit together in different ways. And don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter. I have a list of outages that I'm putting in each one of the newsletters. And I'm going to tell you that this was a really hard one to write because there were so many people that were finding out this month. I couldn't put all of them in there. I'm just putting some highlights, ones that I like, postmortems that I read and learned something from. So if you like reading postmortems and want to gather some of that, go ahead and sign up for the newsletter at sub.fafo.fm, sub.fafo.fm. It's in the links in the show notes. Just click on it. Enjoy the episode. Can you believe it? This ad spot is available. If you're interested in reaching this audience, interested about infrastructure and engineering and security and cloud and all of these things, reach out to us. We have ad spots available, including current packages with some great guests coming up, as well as the back catalog, which also has some amazing guests and people and topics. Go to the URL fafo.fm/sponsor. You'll see all the packages there. We can get you set up. Literally, if you sign up for one, we can put you in this episode before everyone downloads it. So reach out, let us know. We'll talk to you soon. Welcome to Fork Around and Find Out, the podcast about building, running, and maintaining software and systems. Hello and welcome to Fork Around and Find Out, the podcast with more pods than your Kubernetes cluster. I'm your host, Justin Garrison.
Oh, wow.
With me, as
Coming in
always.
hot.
You know, I had to bring out another pun. You know, I forgot to do them for a little while, and this is the perfect show for it because on the show today as a guest we have Joe Beda. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
I feel like your name sounds so cool. Like it's like one of it could be in like a Marvel superhero like name.
Well,
Like
Oh, it does seem like a.
what I love about
Yeah.
my last name is that it's actually hexadecimal.
Oh, that is sweet.
And so
So
if you
cool and
if you turn
nerdy.
it into a color and you do 00 beta or beta 00, it's actually this nice chartreuse or sort of like a lime green. And when I did Spiffy, I actually used that as the colors for the Spiffy logo. So
That's
the
so
Easter
rad.
egg is that I used my last name as sort of the color codes in the Spiffy logo.
You were meant
I
for
literally-
this life.
I tried to do the same thing with Sidearrow, where it's like I just converted as much as possible, like leet speak hex, and it turns into like this bright green. Then I was like, that's kind of like console green. Like this is pretty good. Yeah, sweet. Joe, the first time I remember interacting with you, I was working at Disney Animation. I don't remember how we jumped on a call, but you offered to jump on a call with me while I was trying to understand Kubernetes in general and how things would be laid out. And I had this idea about like hierarchies and things, and you were so nice to not only jump a call and just explain labels to me, just in general. Like I still remember this because at the time, like I was still like trying to like secretly bring Kubernetes into the space. And so I like rented one of the conference rooms that were down the hall that no one would see me in, that I could go sit in and like do my I got to do some Kubernetes research over here. And we sat there and you gave me this great overview about like why Kubernetes went with labels, like why you were doing it this way. And ever since then, like I've always known you as being one of the most approachable, nicest people in the cloud native community
thank
in
you.
general, and just like always open to talk to someone and help them better themselves in any way they wanted to. And so, first of all, I just appreciate that because I think that does set like what a lot of people know of as today as like cloud native as being welcoming is a lot thanks to folks like you and Sarah Novotny and people that were doing this super early that were like, we just need to make sure that everyone has a place and it doesn't matter their skill set or their knowledge level or any of their misconceptions about what this is. We want them to be welcome to be able to come and just try to learn and do things.
I mean, we're all newbies at one point, right?
A
Even
lot of
even the
people
creator
forget
of
that
Kubernetes.
though. Like,
Oh, yeah.
I
No,
think
I mean, this is
people
one of
are
the I love that, like, you have to be crappy at something before you can get good at something, right? And that's just, there's no way to get good without going through the crappy stage. And some of it stay at the crappy stage depending on the activity, right? Like I got into modular synthesizers because they're really cool, and I suck. I'm so bad, but it doesn't matter as long as you're having fun,
Yeah.
That's so cool though, like, those are my favorite people that are just absolutely brilliant, and you meet them at a conference somewhere, and you're like, "Not only are you talking to me, but you're willing to teach me," like, I just feel like that's, like, the best humans, and you get, like, the best karma for that.
And speaking of being crappy, Joe, can you tell us about your career, about the things you started doing? Because I think that a lot of people realize that they can dislike you for more than just the YAML.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
No, you can definitely blame me for some of the YAML.
I like
So
how he
I
complimented you first, and then he was like,
No,
"And then the
no.
YAML's your fault."
well, I know the
Shade.
IE6 as well, and so that's what I
Yeah.
wanted to kind of
Yeah.
go into.
Yeah, we'll talk about IE, but, like, I did give this talk. It was at a software circus, and it was during COVID, and they did it all online, and it was a Halloween-themed talk, and it was Sorry for the YAML, where I talked about sort of, like, the ins and outs of why YAML and the problems there, but I gave it in a blow-up Pickle Rick costume that I just gave away as part of this latest house move.
Oh my
Um,
god, you're my
and then
favorite.
I
Like,
did
there
and
was
then
a
I'm like, how am I
pickle?
gonna mic myself up in the Pickle Rip costume? So like Justin, I just got more gear. And so I have like a wireless lavalier mic that I got just so that I can mic myself up inside the inflatable Pickle Rick costume. But that was the
Worth it.
YAML story. Yeah, totally worth it. Um, it's committing to the bit.
Yeah.
But okay, so my career. So I went so first of all, I'm a second generation programmer. My dad was an entrepreneur.
Hmm.
He started a company when I was growing up that back when the postal service was adding zip codes to mailing lists. If you were sending out a lot of
Wow.
mail and you were, sending out catalogs or whatever, and you had zip codes, you get a discount on your postage. And so he wrote a company that would essentially attach zip codes to, address lists. And it was ended up selling that company, Pitney Bowes, that does a lot of mailing stuff. Um, but it was one of those sort of like very clear. It's like you pay us so much, you save that much on postage, you'll earn it out in a year type of thing.
Yeah.
And so I remember growing up, he would bring home punch cards we would use as shopping lists, paper, and he would disappear at night to program an IBM 360s because that's when he could get computer time and all that. So a lot of my like early life was programming and just introduction to computers. Um, and then went to college at Harvey Mudd. We were just talking about that before we jumped on the call here down in on LA. Met my wife there, did a computer science degree there, and did a couple of internships at Microsoft while I was there. And then joined Microsoft out of college, and I had a choice between the NT kernel team and Internet Explorer. Now, this was in '97, and I was like, I don't know if this internet thing is going anywhere, but like there's a lot more people doing stuff, moving faster, shipping faster. And so, like, at
Hmm.
that point, I chose IE because I'm like, when there's a lot of action, when there's a lot of stuff going on, that's going to be good for your career. And I think that I think when you see a downturn, it can be a bit of a double-edged sword. But I think when things are moving, when people are active, when you're shipping, and like there's that excitement, that's always something that I've gravitated to a little bit in terms of what I pick. So I joined Internet Explorer right around IE4. So that through IE5, IE55, and then IE6, and then stayed
The
on in
eternal
Microsoft.
browser. IE6 lasted forever.
Well, yeah, this is my thing is that like I will defend this to the death, and like I think a lot of the work that we did between IE4 and IE6 established essentially the modern web. It was done sort of contemporaneously with the W3C stuff, but the idea of the modern DOM, where it's like you have this object model, you tweak something, it shows up on screen. that was really pioneered by the IE team back in the IE4 days. The competition at that point was Netscape Navigator, and their sort of dynamic solution was to have essentially these layers, is what they called it, where you could have multiple web pages that kind of layered and composited on top of each other, not nearly as interactive. Now, I'm not going to claim credit for that because I was just a newbie right out of college, had no idea what was going on. But a lot of the work that we did in that time was essentially modernizing the rendering engine so that it could deal with more and more dynamism, and it really led to the web that we have today. I think the sin was Microsoft stopping development and essentially letting IE6 rot for God knows how long and declare victory when in reality there was more to do. And so, yeah, so I was at Microsoft. I did client frameworks. So this Windows Presentation Foundation was codenamed Avalon. That's a lot of the IE team's transition to do that, which was really about sort of bringing some of the early, some of the sort of dynamism that you get on the web to Windows development. In some
Did
ways,
that first
success.
land in that was pre-Vista, right?
Yeah, so this was
That was
being
XP?
happening during Vista and then landed with Vista,
Yeah.
and I ended up leaving Microsoft for Google. Right before Vista shipped, but it was one of those, like, you saw the writing on the wall. It was a project that wasn't converging, and you're like, career-wise, at Microsoft at that time, the only, you would ship a version of Windows, and then there would be a game of musical chairs as different
Mm,
people left, and then there'd be opportunity for advancement to take on
yeah.
more responsibility. And so if things aren't shipping, then that game of musical chairs doesn't run, and there's a lot less, room for you to actually step up and take on more responsibility. So that was one of the things that led to me leaving Microsoft at
And
that time.
the code name was Longhorn, right, for Vista?
Yeah.
So it was like it took a while. I was running the Longhorn betas, like, back in the day, and, like, before Vista finally came out, it was just like, "Okay, this is a little rough because it was a big change from XP."
Yeah, and Longhorn was really sort of 3 big efforts, all built on, CLR, managed code, C# stuff. There was Windows Presentation Foundation. There was Windows, File System, which was essentially re-envisioning the file system as a database. Some really cool ideas there, but, like, I think like a lot of stuff, it
Yeah.
was probably ahead of its time. And then there was a whole sort of networking subsystem and communication subsystem that I even forget about. But I think out of those things, I think Windows Presentation Foundation probably saw the most sort of uptake through time. But even then, it's been seen twists and turns and so many different interesting aspects out of that, and so many lessons to be
Mhm.
learned.
What was it like working at Microsoft in those, like, early days and working on, you know, Internet Explorer?
It was an exciting place to be because, there's been times in my career when you felt like everything was happening all at once. And I think the early internet, working on the browser, it was Netscape, eventually Firefox, a lot of that stuff, those sort of early browser wars was incredibly exciting. In some ways that reminds me of like early Kubernetes days when we were, in cloud, when you're like, I remember it's like, "Oh, what's the latest announcement? How does this change our plans? Oh my
Mm.
god, they're ahead of us." It's like there's this sort of like this sort of energy in the air when some of those things are happening. I think you're definitely seeing that with AI now, whether
Yeah.
you like it or not. It's definitely a moment with a ton of excitement, a ton of action. Nobody quite knows where things are going, and the next announcement from whomever can change the landscape pretty dramatically. And so I think there were definitely parallels between early browser wars, cloud native cloud stuff with, when I was working on GCE and then Kubernetes and then I think what we're seeing happening today with AI. It's so fascinating you see those parallels happen.
What do you when you look at AI and the parallels, I know everyone's probably asking you this question, but, like, what do you think is gonna stick? Like, do you think it's really gonna revolutionize technology the same way, like, the cloud did and, like, internet? Or
Autumn, move your mic a little closer.
oh, sorry. Yeah.
Um, I think we're still figuring there's definitely a hype cycle around AI, and I think there's certain domains where it's been overplayed and there's other domains where it's clearly effective. Um, I think that when it comes to coding and sort of the stuff that a lot of us do day to day, um, it's almost perfectly well suited for a lot of the AI stuff that we see. It's like there's a ton of examples out there with GitHub, right? I mean, it's like I name a domain where there's as much prior art, except for maybe writing, right? Whereas we're seeing that. But I think part of it also is that the tools to validate whether something is holds water or not are also automatable and work in sort of computer time versus human time, right? And I think this is one of those things that when certain things happen in human time, right? Like think about, racking and stacking servers pre-cloud, right? You get a certain level of output. And then you see these phase shifts where with cloud, all of a sudden things that used to take, weeks or months now can happen in minutes or hours on the outside that fundamentally changes how you actually view technology. And I think we see similar stuff with AI where there are certain tasks that were happening at human time that can now happen at computer time. And it changes how you view that. And even if it's not exactly the same thing, the fact that you can do, 10 of things, 100 of things all at once, and it can happen, within 10 minutes or, an hour on the outside versus taking weeks or days, even if the quality is not there, it fundamentally changes it. And I think the coding aspect, the computer side of this stuff, because compilers and unit tests and all that stuff is out there, that means that you can iterate at computer time instead of iterating at human time. Whereas if you think about like, hey, like medicine or law or so many other domains where people want to apply AI, there's some utility there, I'm sure, but you can't turn that crank and actually get results on computer time because, like, at the end of the day, is this legal brief good or not? I don't know. You really kind of need, at some point, a reality check there that is harder to do with just a purely computerized system. But programming is actually, I think, the sweet spot right now, and I don't think we're going to see it go away. But I think there's I've been I like to try and come up with sort of pithy ways to think about these things, and nothing I've seen has dissuaded me of the fact that AI can enhance expertise, but it cannot replace expertise. And so even, in the domain where we're seeing so much AI have impact on programmers, you have to understand what the technology can do. You have to understand what's possible. You have to have taste in terms of what good looks like. If you're applying it to like replace SAS, like, oh, I want to like write AI that does a tax thing, like you need to understand the tax code well enough to be able to guide the AI. I'm not, you can't trust it to do medicine or tax or lawyering all on its own. But if you know what good looks like, if you know when it's going off the rails, it can be a huge accelerator. And I think that is something that we're seeing again and again. But we're all over the place on topics. I don't know where you wanna take
I
this,
actually
Justin. I'm
think
just ranting at you.
that was a really good, a really level-headed assessment of AI, right? Like, I think people were like, "Oh, it's magic," and then, like, now I feel like we're finally getting to the point of people seeing where it's good and where it's bad and what you can do with it, and I'm like, "Yes," like, heads are like, level-headedness is prevailing. Like, how do you think we teach people the taste, though? How do we teach young engineers taste?
Yeah.
I
How do you learn that expertise in
Where do you
general,
get the
right? Like
smell
once
test? You know what I mean? And
yeah.
how do you, like, still get those, like, the iteration to, like, grow, and to get better?
I think that's a really good question. I think, one of the things that I think computer people excel at is being systems thinkers, looking at just not something, but looking at how it relates to other things, right? Whether it's like, this whole idea of sort of systems thinking. There's the Thinking in Systems book, right? Or,
I just read that.
yeah,
Yeah.
which is fascinating because it has nothing to do with computers. So
Yeah.
what's the author's name? Danielle, I want to
Don't
say.
quiz me on it.
Yeah.
Was it a good book?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah,
Donnella?
Donnell Meadows, yeah.
Donna Meadows.
Um, so what's interesting is that it's and this is one of the courses I took in college was called systems engineering, where you're looking at whether it's water systems or electrical systems, but also when you look at supply chain systems, when you look at flow of data through a bunch of queues in a distributed system, all of these things have a lot of sort of commonality between them. And I think as, technical people thinking about computers, you start to get an intuitive understanding of how these things connect and how something over here can impact something over here, and that nothing really stands alone. And I think through my career, I've seen that apply to people and organizations too, right? So when you think about the organization of like, how does a company work? That's a system, right? And how does an industry work? That's a system also. And there's sort of human systems, there's commercial systems, there's technical systems. But when you look at sort of the programming as as a discipline, as sort of a labor market, that's a system also. And so the question that, you're asking of like, how do you build that taste? How do you build that experience? Well, like, a lot of places, there's an apprenticeship, right? When I joined, I did a lot of scut work on the IE team, right? And some of it was like real engineering, or like redesigning the core data structures of the rendering engine. A lot of it was just BS busy work, right? And sweeping the floors, but with respect to the code base. And I think that's something that a lot of AI can take over for, which is good. But also it means that how do you actually get started in the industry? How do people actually get familiar with things, to sort of build that taste, build that idea of what good looks like? And I think that that's something that we're going to have to face as an industry, is that the sort of the opportunities for apprenticeship are less and less as people just focus on output instead of actually thinking about how do I actually grow the market. I think, I mentioned that I started off at Microsoft. I did a couple of internships there while I was in college. Those things were incredibly, formative. And I think Microsoft at the time saw it as their duty to actually, build the next generation of programmers, both for Microsoft and for others, and did stuff like the internship program. And I worry that those things are going to disappear and that we're not going to see as much of that going forward because
Me
of,
too.
of
I
AI
think
and
I
LLMs.
think they just wanna get senior engineers, and I'm like, "But how do you grow that?" Like, that's, um,
At some point, there won't be any senior engineers on the
Yeah.
market, right?
not just that, but, like, I don't think that leak code was ever really a good interview process, but it's going to even more. Like, I think that, like, from what I've heard from a lot of really smart people like yourself is that, like, creativity, imagination, the systems thinking, none of that is leak code. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
None of that shows you the curiosity or, like, I think the, almost kind of relentlessness of what you're gonna need to, like, stay relevant, and, like, so how do we even look for that in people?
Yeah, I found that the way I interview people has changed over time. I think, having some level of like, can you take a problem? Can you break it down? Can you develop a algorithm that maybe is a little novel and can you translate that to code? I think being able to show that in an interview is reasonable, but the elite code stuff where it's like people are just like,
Memorizing.
memorizing all these different things, it's just like, I don't think that's not the job, right? So I think, through Heptio, the startup that I did, and VMware, and sort of, as I help people out with interviewing now, I focus more on like, can you describe a problem well? Can you actually write a document that actually like, represents your thinking? Can you work with others? So I think communication, technical reasoning, and sort of like intuition, those are the types of things that I look for now when I interview, more than just sort of like, hey, leak code type of problems. I was never a huge fan of those, and
Yeah.
even less so over time.
That,
And,
like,
and
literally makes my heart happy though, because I think a lot of people that especially, like, women and people that don't come from, like, very fancy backgrounds are even more, like, kind of, what is the word I'm looking for? I just like, the statistics of women retrying technical, like, interviews, like, a lot of them will just not finish, especially girls, and I think that, like, a lot of this is just going to make it worse to keep diversity in tech, and I think that the way that you're actually, like, describing that, that's actually interviewing for the job, Especially, like, if you're not neurotypical, like, those interviews are rough, So I think that that makes me, like, happy that people that have that kind of power, but also that our voices that we listen to are saying these things out loud.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that, we have this tendency to try and over focus on the things we can measure, and the leak code type of interview stuff is something that's pretty measurable. Um, but I think, to anytime you're building a product, anytime you're hiring, there's like, 12 different axes that you're evaluating stuff on, but you tend to over focus on the things you can measure instead of like, hey, how do you measure, technical sort of, reasoning, systems thinking, communication, teamwork? Like those things are much squishier. And so I think, there's definitely an over focus on other things, but we see it in technical things also. When I was working on GCE, for example, we had certain metrics that we would measure, like how fast could we boot up a VM, right? And like, I know at that point, Amazon was 5 minutes, GCE was like a minute. And I'm like, there's other things we should work on. But then we had other people that are like, well, can we get that down to 15 seconds? I'm like, that's not a bad thing, but also what about this other stuff? Early
Yeah.
Kubernetes, it's like we had a scaling limit of 100 nodes. And I'm like, there's nothing, that's just work to get to 1,000 or whatever. But other people like, we're knocking on Kubernetes because of that. I'm like, we have other fish to fry, but like oftentimes if there's a number, people over focus on that. And I think you see the same
I,
thing with hiring and things like leak code.
I generally describe it as like being data blinded, right?
Yeah,
When
Yeah.
you're data
that's a good term.
driven, you want the numbers, and then all of a sudden the numbers the only thing, and you're like, actually, it doesn't matter anymore,
Not
right?
just
Like
that, but this industry very much incentivizes the data driven for, like, promotion and for,
it's
like
a badge of honor
yeah,
for companies that they're like, we want to be like Google, so we're data driven, and I'm like, but
exactly.
data's not the whole story, right? Like
Not just
data's
that,
gonna
but
give you pieces.
it's the causation versus, like, actually, like, being you're proving something, like, are you actually proving something? Or, like, because think about it, if he just like you said, at 5 minutes, first minute, is that not good enough to now go
Yeah.
to the next thing?
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, what's good? Like
So Vista's
Oh,
coming out. It's going to be a failure. Let's go back to this timeline. And now you're
yeah.
going over to Google. Why'd you switch? What would you switch doing?
So a bunch of the folks that I worked with early on in IE that I enjoyed working with had went over and joined Google and were starting up the office in the Seattle area, starting in Kirkland, which is on the east side. And and this is actually one of the things in my career is that like when I'm evaluating an opportunity, there's all sorts of things that you can be like, what's important to me as I'm doing this? And I think for me, I think, I've tried to stay consistent over time of like who I'm working with is number one. Um, who I'm working for is actually important. Like I think, in your career you can choose your boss. And I think that applies both to your immediate boss, but like the organization that you're working for, and that has a huge impact on your success. What I'm working on then comes in, right? And then I think like things like comp are further down on the list. I kind of let that, once you're at a certain level, I let that take care of itself. Now that being said, I'm not superhuman, right? At some point when people are waving big checks in front of you, it does shift your thinking, right? So none of these things are pure. But I think who you're working with day to day, I think has such an impact on whether you like going to work. And so a lot of the folks that I had enjoyed working with early on in IE, and then at some point, like things shatter and people start going their different ways. A lot of those folks were starting at Google. And so I joined Google. And at that time, Google viewed engineers as fungible so that you would come
Mm.
in and be like, oh, smart people could work on anything. And so I had no idea what I was going to be working on when I joined Google. And
And this would have been 2006, 2005.
2004. So here's
Okay.
I have this
Do you have a
here. So
timeline?
when 10 years, so like I was at Microsoft for like 7 or 8 years, and then my 10-year thing at Google was a
Oh, nice.
little thing. I still have that sitting around. But so 2004, right after the IPO. In fact, I was interviewing pre-IPO, joined post-IPO.
Mm.
Uh, which was definitely a very exciting time to be at Google. But also at that time, like it was before the sort of rivalry between Google and Microsoft was heating up.
Okay.
But like as that happened, as we opened the Kirkland office, Google started hiring a ton of people from Microsoft, and things got pretty nasty. Steve Ballmer throwing chairs, that type of thing. But I think people who aren't in the Seattle area don't understand sort of how back at that time how sort of like dominant and stable Microsoft was in this area. I
Mm.
think, I have a friend who's been at Microsoft for about 30 years, right? He's, a couple years older than me, joined right out of colleges and been there the whole time. That level of retention is almost unheard of in our industry. But I think Microsoft has that sort of that level of old school Microsoft people who've been there forever, who live and bleed Microsoft. It's changing now, but at that time, having somebody like Google come in and start hiring people really ruffled a bunch of feathers because it was shaking things up in a way that made a lot of people very uncomfortable. So yeah, so I joined Google. I ended up working on Google Talk, the chat system. But along the way, we built out, not me personally, but the people on the team built out the peer to peer stack for doing. Um, for doing voice, video, and then eventually things like file transfer. That got open sourced and released as this thing called libjingle, which ends up being the sort of underpinnings for WebRTC in the browser. So it's one of these things where we did this stuff for Google Talk, and the code lived on in new ways. It's same protocols, different code base underpins things like Tailscale for doing sort of peer-to-peer connectivity, that type of thing. So that was fun to work on. I led a team that hooked us, Google, up to the telephone system, and so learned a lot about SIP and did a signaling protocol for XMPP, all sorts of fun
I was gonna say,
stuff.
was that wasn't Google Voice, was it?
It was Google
Or
Voice, yeah. So it
okay,
was like Google Talk and Google Voice.
yeah,
So the way that it worked is we did Google Talk. A PM at that point went out and spearled the Grand Central acquisition. And I think in sometimes you have people who just do an acquisition because they want to do an acquisition because they want to feel like they're like important. And so there was a little bit of that going on, maybe with Grand Central. That turned into Google Voice. These things kind of got blended together, but. And it was one of those things where the Grand Central folks came in and said, "You guys don't know what you're doing." But honestly, when I look back at the stuff that we did early on with Google Talk and hooking to the telephone system, it has a lot of echoes of like Twilio. And so like I
yeah,
think if we had kept that stuff and moved it forward and offered it as part of cloud, it would have been a really great competitor to Twilio, but it kind of got lost in the shuffle with the Grand Central Google Voice stuff.
sure.
But then all that stuff turned into Hangouts and like, a lot of the technology
8
that we're
different
using right now
messaging
to do this
services and yeah,
podcast is built on some of that stuff. Um, and then I transitioned. I'm like, I got to pay the bills, and so I did some advertisement stuff. This thing called uh, it was essentially ads optimization. So when people are in the ads console, how do we actually give them suggestions so that they can actually advertise and, really do win-win for them and
mm,
Google at the time was like, we help you find ads that are going to pay off, and that helps everybody, and all that type of thing. But um, it was early sort of machine learning, pre sort of LLM, sort of AI stuff that was
yeah,
interesting to be involved and see. I mean, Google's always been a machine learning AI company at heart, even before sort of the latest sort of explosion. But it was interesting to sort of see that early on. And then we had a kid and came back, and I could not make myself give a crap about ads anymore. Um, and so there was a director in Seattle, the Seattle Fremont office of Google, who was focused on system stuff. And so we were like, hey, at the time, there were these underpowered computers called netbooks, and we're like, let's build an operating system for netbooks. And that and there were some folks down in Mountain View that were having the same idea that eventually became Chrome OS and Chromebooks. But because of sort of politics at Google, there wasn't a lot of room for leadership from Seattle when it was the Chrome folks. And we wanted to build on top of Android, but at that point, like Android and Chrome hated each other, right? So Chrome OS now it's all sort of like they looked at it and eventually sanity prevails. And you're like,
yeah,
really,
it's
should
coming full
Google
circle.
be
Yeah,
having like two Linux sort of like operating systems, right? But like, I'm like, can we reuse the compositor for Android and use that on the Chromebooks and stuff like that, ARM, all that stuff. But like, uh, uh, so we kind of got squeezed out of the Chrome OS stuff early on. And so Plan B was doing infrastructure cloud. And in fact, we called it Plan B. The original code name for Google Cloud was Plan B. Um, Now, at that point,
I
Google
feel like you
had,
have to have the best stories. You're talking about Microsoft versus Google and then, like, Android and, like, Chrome, like, you
I mean,
do
just,
you have, like, a
you're around
crazy
long
story
enough
that,
and
like,
you,
nobody else you think knows outside of the Seattle scene? Like
yeah, this stuff just happens. But I do think it's fascinating that like Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, all the cloud stuff is actually, started out of Seattle. Now, a lot of the cloud stuff has moved down to Mountain View um, and Amazon's spread all over, but the center is there. Now, just to be fair, like there was already Google App Engine that had been around for a while. That was being run out of the San Francisco office. But doing infrastructure level cloud, I mean, like I looked at it and I'm like, look, we're not really in this game unless we're doing VMs and storage, the sort of the core parts of cloud. Um, and so yeah, so there were a group of us that started the infrastructure cloud. We eventually called that Nebula, and the three starting projects. That was the internal code name. Were
I was gonna say, who comes up with these names? I feel like after working at Amazon and Microsoft, the names that they name things are just it's so interesting.
Well, you come up with great names internally, and none of those things see
Oh
the
my
light of
god, that
day.
is so true. The internal code names are
Totally.
so
But
much better
sometimes
than
the
the
internal code
names.
names are bad because I'm just about to tell you the three sort of initial efforts that we did as part of Nebula was Big Store, which turned into Google Cloud Storage. BigQuery, which is still BigQuery, right? Because I looked around and I'm like, what are internal Google services that are almost ready to be packaged up and externalized? And Dremel, which turned into which is the basis for BigQuery, was like probably 80% there already.
Mm.
And it was a unique thing that took advantage of the switching architecture in Google's data centers. And so that was the first thing. And then Big Cluster was ended up being GCE, right? Horrible
They were like,
name,
"We're
right?
making
Oh, big
everything
cluster.
big."
Google Big Cluster would be the
Yeah.
best.
And I still have early, the original logo. I have, some early artwork that I stole off the walls and like an old sweatshirt and stuff like that. So I keep some of that stuff around. Um, but at some point, but Google, like the Google leadership at the time was not a fan of infrastructure cloud at all
Yeah.
because they couldn't build data centers fast enough to satisfy internal demand for things like Gmail. And so a lot of the thinking there was like, look, if we're going to put a machine in a data center, we're better off doing something high value, high margin, like inventing the next Gmail or the next ad, whatever, instead of just running it out for parts. Now, eventually they changed their mind on that stuff. And I think a couple of drivers there. Number one is that the margins are not that low, right? I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of room if you can run this stuff efficiently to make real money, especially when it comes to like one of the things that's obviously super high margin is network egress for clouds, right? Because
Yeah.
you're charging per bytes, but you buy per bandwidth, and so there's all sorts of arbitrage to be had there. Um, and nobody's seen those prices go down over time, and that the cost of goods for doing like
Yeah.
bandwidth and fiber has just dropped dramatically over time for doing
Which is also
doing
funny to think
egress.
that they like Gmail was high value. Like Gmail's as the free service that everyone uses has a lot of value to Google.
Right, because I mean, it's a place to show ads, and ads are
Yeah.
just that lucrative.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing there is that when I joined Google, um, they love to brag. Urs, who was head of a technical infrastructure at Google forever and is now, I think, still officially at Google, but working out of New Zealand. He was always against people working remotely until COVID hit, and he moved to New Zealand and made an exception for him. So who knew, right? Everybody else is coming back to the office, but he's still in New Zealand.
Oh, you
Um,
keep it real and it's my favorite.
yeah. But anyway, so like at the end of the day, people like Urs, like, they love to brag that, Google was probably the second largest computer manufacturer back in the early 2000s, right? Like behind Dell or HP. I forget which one. It's probably Dell. But it was only for Google data centers. Google was building like, stuff for their own use, not selling it externally. And with that, they had enormous pricing power, both when it came to data centers, dark fiber, but also negotiations with like Intel and AMD. And so there's lots of situations where Google would be like, hey, like, Carolinas, we want to put a data center in the Southwest. Who can give us the best tax deal? And then North Carolina and South Carolina would compete to see who could give the better deal. And then be like, okay, we're taking both of them, right? So they would do that type of thing a lot. Buy up dark fiber. Chris Sacca, who was an early lawyer at Google, helped sponsor some of the early Google Talk stuff. Went on to become a VC and like was on TV doing Shark Tank and stuff. Um, uh, 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 did a whole bunch of early stuff around like buying data center. This is before Google was building their own data centers. They would sell you data center per square foot, but Google would actually be able to actually use more power than anybody else based on
Mm.
density. Now you buy data center space
Yeah.
based on kilowatts, not square
Yeah.
foot, but like that was back in the day. So all sorts of arbitrage there. But with that, Google had a lot of purchasing power and negotiating power with vendors, things like Intel and AMD. And with the rise of cloud, all of a sudden Google was no longer the big kid on the block. And so to some degree, to maintain those advantages, cloud was one of those ways to just make sure that Google was still operating at the scale that actually kept them competitive when it came to actually acquiring compute
Mm.
resources.
Sure.
So I think that was one of the drivers over time to make cloud real also.
But this was your first like infrastructure job, right?
Yeah,
Like
I mean,
moving
before
into
that,
that.
I mean, like, I had done, I never worked on Borg. I never worked on the data center stuff. I had always done sort of like ads and stuff like that. But, it's like I spent an enormous amount of time just studying Amazon, using it, talking to users, understanding what cloud was, comparing and contrasting that to Google's internal stuff, and read a lot about OpenStack, at the time, and all that went into designing GCE and influencing things like GCS. I was a little bit involved in GCS, but not nearly as much as with GCE. And so GCE was a really fascinating project to be part of from the get go because our goal was to build on as much Google infrastructure as possible. So we wanted to run on top of Borg. Google did not believe in virtualization at that point, especially not hardware assisted virtualization.
Hmm.
So it was all containerization, and there were a lot of folks that were. I didn't know them personally, but my understanding was that they'd been at Transmeta, which was this sort of like startup that did like chips, but the whole idea is that they would do live translation of code before it executed type of thing. So it's a different approach to sort of doing virtualization versus what we ended up doing with GCE was building on top of KVM that used processor features
Yeah.
to be able to do virtualization. And that ended up being allowed us to run VMs inside of containers on top of Borg. When Borg was essentially the internal container orchestrator that predated Kubernetes. And
Yeah.
so, but we didn't have any virtual network, so we had to create a virtual network system from the get go. Google didn't have a virtual block device because everything was GFS and Colossus, which, if you squint at it, looks a little bit like S3 or GCS.
Yeah.
And so we had to build a block device, distributed, fault tolerant, snapshotable block device from the ground up. Uh,
Multi-zone too, which was a big feature.
yeah, so, like, yeah, a lot of the stuff that we were thinking about from the get-go was, like, how do we use because Google had so much dark fiber between regions and stuff, by default, Google's network is actually connected between regions, so you don't have to set up sort of, like, hacky VPNs to
Yeah.
actually talk between regions. You can just talk from one region to another region with Google, and it's all private. So stuff like that, we had a lot more capabilities and bandwidth for moving stuff between zones and even between regions, and so we were able to take advantage of that. So in a lot of places, we were able to differentiate versus sort of where, Amazon and AWS was at the time. Um, but the truth of the matter is that this stuff was all at the edges, and so we launched GCE. It was a ton of work. The company started seeing value of like, "Hey, we really wanna be in the cloud game." But it really didn't move the needle, right? At the end of the day, it was
Yeah.
it was working around the edges and playing catch up in a lot of ways. And so that's what really led to number 1, it was getting that led to Kubernetes. And so me and Brendan and Craig, were rolling off of other projects. It was getting harder to get stuff done in cloud because as it got more important, as more people came on board, there was more process. It felt like you were sort of swimming through molasses to get anything done. Um, and we knew that we needed to shake things up to actually make Google competitive in cloud, and
Mhm.
so that's what led to
And
Kubernetes.
before we jump into the Kubernetes, you mentioned the politics and dynamics between the Chrome OS team and the Android team originally. How was that with GCE and App Engine?
Oh, it was awful.
All right, that's what I thought. All right.
No, and it was just it's a fundamentally different way of viewing the world, right?
Yeah.
I think the App Engine folks I don't wanna misrepresent because I think there are some good people, and you're always these cases where you
Well,
like somebody personally. Like Kevin Gibbs was the guy who led App Engine at the time. Great guy. I just, didn't agree with him on a lot of technical stuff, right?
and as
Just
an
a different
That's the
view.
thing.
outsider,
That's totally
as an outsider of the whole thing, it always seemed that App Engine said, "You form your app to our infrastructure," and GCE was exactly the opposite. It's like, "We will form our infrastructure to your app." And that's like the fundamental differences of like, "Hey, if you wanna do it the Google way or the way that we recommend, use App Engine. And if we wanna make money from customers, if we want actual customers, we gotta go adjust."
I think you see this story play out so many different times when it's like platform as a service types of things
Yeah.
where and we saw it in App Engine, but you'll see it with Heroku, you'll see it with Cloud Foundry, you'll see it with things like Vercel, where these things they're essentially fixed architecture. If your app fits into a specific architecture, these
Yeah.
things can work very well, and they're more opinionated about how things work. Um, but as apps or applications see success, they'll hit limits of those platforms, right? And so the question is that like, there's this thinking, from the App Engine team at the time of like, well, if we just add this feature or that feature, then that'll get us over the hump, and then we'll solve everybody's problem. But there's an endless
Yeah.
list of small things that need to be done. So, for example, like App Engine at the time, every request coming in, it would be captured and forwarded. There was no streaming. And so there was a limit on the size of the request coming in,
Right.
right? And so I think that limit was like, I don't know. And then they kept increasing the limit over time. But at the end of the day, there's going to be no limit that's going to be big enough. So then there was a way to sort of like transfer it over and have it actually write into an object. But if you're doing video transcoding or streaming stuff, there's always going to be some
Yeah.
case there where you actually need a more raw network versus sort of just doing HTTP type stuff.
Yeah. And this is the fundamental problem I have with platform engineering as like a thing that companies are trying to do where they're trying to build their own Heroku. And I'm like, do all your apps look the same? Are you trying to build one platform that exists for everything? Because what happens when they outgrow it, or there's the stateful stuff over
Yeah.
here that doesn't fit into that thing? It's great for maybe 60, 70% if you actually can just move that direction. That was Disney Plus. We had a great platform that we forced everyone, you have to meet our architecture. But then everything else that outgrew it or had different requirements, like, sorry, you got to do everything yourself. And we can't even help you with a little bit. It's like, no. You go you go get a different AWS account and go have fun.
I really think that there could be a middle ground, but they just, it's just those things.
I
I
mean,
do
if I had it in me to do another startup, I would do one around platform engineering, but I'll explain in a second what that would be.
I do have 2 questions
Yeah.
before we get back to Kubernetes. One thing that I thought was really like that stood out about what you were saying is that you went and used AWS and you really thought about, and like, why don't we promote the strategy and the customer like obsession truly as an engineer? Like I feel like it's so disjointed from like actual like being technical in business, but that's why they pay us. Like, you know what I mean? Like to me that's so interesting the way that business and technology like come together and how you can really be competitive in the market. And I feel like we make such bonehead mistakes ignoring like really looking at our competitors when we're building things and looking at what's already out there that you just end up reinventing the wheel over and over and over again. Like why is that not a bigger part?
I have theories. You wanna hear my theories?
I do.
Yes.
Um, so I think a lot of business leaders, so it comes back to like, remember when, oh god, what's his face who led Pepsi took over Apple, right? So there
Yeah.
is this
Schiller.
management theory that like good management actually transcends domains. Um, and baked into that is this idea of management and labor. And if you're going to have labor, if you're going to view people like, and the question is like, is the work that we do, is it management? Is it labor? Is it knowledge work? Is it something in between? And how does that change with AI? I don't know, right? This is,
I
I think,
always
part of
wonder
the
if it's
question.
gonna make people if it's gonna make the soft skills and the business and being and like almost like if engineers will become engineers and PMs at the same time or just kind of take a little bit of that middle work out because I really wonder if and honestly, I'm just excited because I think women are great at that.
No, but this is
Like
actually what I'm getting to is that I think part of that mindset is that you have job descriptions, and those job descriptions are useful in terms of hiring, in terms of leveling, in terms of pay scales, all these different things. But the map is not the territory. People are not their job description.
Oh my god,
And so
that's
I
so
think
true.
one of the things that you find is that like I've always viewed myself as a business person who specializes in technology, right? And so through my career, I'm like, I want to understand the business context, I want to understand the customers, and then like the programming, the architecture, that stuff is all downstream of actually sort of being based in the business. But there's a lot of places in large companies, and I saw this at Microsoft, I saw this at Google, whereas if you're an engineer and you're like, well, I have opinions on the business model, they're like, "Stay in your lane, that's not
Yeah.
your job,"
Oh,
right?
I
Yeah.
felt like I deal with that all the time. So how do you, like, navigate that asking for a friend, the friend's me, and everybody
Um,
else? Like
I
like, how did you
I
build this wonderful career, but still get to do that when when the job description didn't fit you and you were trying to make it fit you or trying to show that you had these skills?
I mean, the answer is burnout. I mean, no,
Again,
because
you
I think
keep it
so
real,
no,
like
'cause for me, what happens is that if you're one of those people that is cross-discipline, where you don't fit neatly into a job description, what you'll find is that you look around and you're like, everything is so dumb. Why don't we just fix it? Right. And for me, the driver for burnout is when you feel ownership over something, but you don't have the tools to impact it. When you are pushing a rock that's not going to move, you're going to burn out. And I think if you're at a big company and you feel ownership over sort of like, cross functional sort of like type of things, um, and I think good people feel a deep level of ownership over things. They want it to be successful. They want to be proud of their work. That's a combination for burnout. And there's another theory I have. So I'm not
You
going to
didn't
name
have
names.
to attack us like that, Joe. But I think
Well, but
that
I mean,
talking
but
to
okay,
you is
but
so
number one,
rad.
this is one of the reasons why people go to startups because startups, one of their superpowers.
I've been thinking about that, and I was like, I'll only do big tech. I'm never going to startup. And now I'm like, Oxide and some other places look kind of cool.
Yeah.
Like-
One of the superpowers of startups is that, like, they can look at Autumn and they can say, like, we have an Autumn-shaped hole over here that we can actually make work, right? And it's very difficult to actually sort of write your own ticket and find a job that is, like, really suited to you when you don't fit cleanly into one of the disciplines at
Can
a
you
big
write a
company.
book for engineers trying to navigate the crazy like world that we're in? Because
Oh, man.
you have such a good way of being realistic, but also like I don't know.
The problem is that if I were to write a book, I think most business books, like, do you listen to this podcast, If Books Could Kill? I love it. This is Michael Hobbs and
No.
and
No,
oh
but that
god.
sounds very interesting.
Oh, so they have this, they take airport books and self-help books and they just tear them apart, and it's just hilarious. But they have this one book theory, which is like all these books are actually the same book. It's just sort of like said in different ways, right?
I
And I
think a
think
lot
some
of
of this happens.
processes are like that. I think it's a lot of patterns that are
Yeah.
just recycled.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think most business books could be like, boiled down to like a single 8.5 by 11, piece of paper, right? A handout, right? The best ones you need to use both sides. The crappier ones you could do it all on one side, right? And so I
That's so
hesitate to write
real.
a book because I think it would probably be like it would be a pamphlet. I would try
That's
like
fine.
I'd
You
be
can
like
make a
But that
pamphlet.
would
We
still be
take it.
cool though. Like
maybe I should
or
do a zine.
blog or I
I
don't
don't know,
know.
right?
But one
Um,
other question before I forget. Do
yeah.
you think that Google's former partnerships with AMD and how they were building their data centers and kind of the fact that they were an early machine learning shop gave them an edge when they were building Gemini? Because
Um,
it was behind for a while and then it came back so
The
rock
T
hard.
in GPT stands for Google. So that's how.
Um, so if you want to go deep on this stuff, there's another podcast I'll recommend, the Acquired podcast. I'm sure
Yeah.
you guys have seen this one. They did one on Google and Google AI. And and I think, number one, Google Cloud is actually it's one of those things where nobody knew that AI was going to show up the way that it did. And Google Cloud being there and having that infrastructure, that customer base, the ability to sell to enterprise. Obviously, all of that stuff is super convenient to have now as we're entering the AI era. And also, if you look at like Google started making early investments in building their own silicon for doing this stuff with TPUs. And they're on like, I don't know what, like generation 7
Yeah.
of TPUs internally. They're not selling these things externally. You can get access to them through cloud. But I think that did give them the advantage, right? I think Google saw early on that hardware acceleration, through all the machinations. Again, listen to the podcast if you want to hear all the ins and outs. I'm not an expert there, but like, I think Gemini is probably one of the only sort of frontier models run in a way that is not losing outrageous amounts of money because Google owns their infrastructure and actually the TPUs are so much more power efficient than GPUs and it just they're building for a real business versus a lot of the funny money that's happening out in the industry right
And I
now
think
is my take on it.
and that's going to be such a big determiner because I think a lot of this is not sustainable. You know what I mean? We keep saying that it's cheaper than engineers, but is it though? You know what I mean?
I
Like
mean,
so
like, ordering Uber rides used to be cheaper than taxis.
Oh my
Now,
god,
not
I
so
was
much.
writing a blog about this, like, this weekend, and I was thinking about that because so many people are now I use AI, I'm not saying that it's, like, completely I was very, like, anti, and now I think I'm somewhere in the middle, but it's like I want to keep collecting knowledge and using it to learn because I think at some point, we could very likely be the people that are like, you don't wanna be so reliant on it, and then they raise the price and they raise the, like, ability to have it, and then you no longer can use your brain, right? So it's like I wanna almost extract all I can from it, you know?
For sure, for sure.
Joe,
All
we
right,
have
where
like
were we? I don't know. There are like 12 things on the stack. Tell me which
You
one
have
I
to
so
know,
talk
much
but
about.
ADHD here, like
I was like, well, we at minimum have to get to the
Kubernetes.
Kubernetes piece here. I'm like, at some point we're gonna have to have you on for a second round
Yeah, sure,
of
happy to.
everything else.
What would you
But
do differently if you were building Kubernetes today?
Okay, the things I thought we did right. So number one is we open sourced it. There were some people who wanted to actually keep it as a GCP service, or like take Borg and find a way to externalize that. Borg was this hairy C++ code base that was so entwined with the rest of Google, there was no way. So I think starting something new, writing it in Go, because I think that was sort of the right level of approachability and systems level, um, open sourcing it, trying to sort of utilize as much as sort of the Docker stuff at the time. I think all that stuff was right. The way we built community and approached community, I think, paid off in spades.
I think you should be really proud of yourself there because it's still like one of the coolest open source communities out there. Like cloud native, like I'm over there, like I will learn how to do Kubernetes just to hang out with you guys. So like,
Oh, that's awesome. But it was everybody, and I think it was a lot of relatively low ego senior engineers that are like, "Hey, we just got so much shit to do. Let's just get it done," right?
that's hard to
And I
find.
think, and then you have folks like, Justin, you mentioned Sarah. I'll mention Tim Hawkins, right? Like these people are just the absolute backbone of this stuff, right? I mean, more than anybody else. But even starting out, I think, when we first announced Kubernetes, I remember I was trading, tweets with Deepak, who now heads up all compute stuff at AWS. And I'm like, hey, you guys are welcome to join. And like, I'm like, seriously, like, if you want to get involved, get involved. And he's very dismissive at the time, like, well, we'll do Kubernetes when customers start asking for it, which is essentially like bless your heart in Twittery.
I want that on a t-shirt.
And Amazonese, yeah. But like, but then I do remember the reInvent where they announced EKS,
Or EKS, yes.
and that definitely felt like the end of the beginning in terms of this stuff, right? Like, okay, now everybody was on board, and it was fascinating to see that stuff come full circle. But like, even from the get-go, we knew that we wanted more people involved. We knew that for that to be successful as open source, it couldn't just be a Google thing; it had to be a community thing. And
Did you feel like a
and
little
both in
bit of
terms of
petty?
technology and partners and people, we wanted that to
Yeah.
be.
Did you feel a little bit of petty, like I told you so when they released
I
EKS?
hope.
Or
There's
I
a
would
lot
have
of
been
petty.
like I would have screenshotted the old post.
There's not that, because honestly, Deepak is such a nice guy. He really is. I ran into him at Costco years later.
At Costco, I love
Oh,
that
yeah.
so much.
Seattle's pretty small.
Yeah. Well,
That is
Costco
such
number
some
one, the
Seattle
first
stuff,
Costco down in
though.
Soto.
Like,
Yeah.
I've two like people that have been in tech forever, just randomly talking
Oh,
in
yeah.
Costco. Like,
But there are people that I do feel, there are places where I do have some pettiness in my heart, and I try not to talk about it. And I try and let it go. But AWS and those guys, not as much. I mean, they are what they are, right? It's like, there was some underhanded shit early on in cloud, like early on, like we were
give us the
undercutting.
tea.
Yeah, we were undercutting S3 prices with GCS. And we had some early customers that wanted to move a lot of data from S3 um, to GCS. And I know that Amazon was screwing with BGP routes to actually send it through low bandwidth links, so
Shut
that it
up.
was really slow and crappy to move stuff over, right? Because they didn't have a lot of traffic going that way otherwise, and
Yeah.
so they're like, might as well screw stuff going over to Google infrastructure. And
Wow,
so
that is
there was
petty.
some petty bullshit like that early on. But Amazon is Amazon. It is what it is,
Yeah.
right? It's like early on in Kirkland, I was working with Steve Yagi, and to hear him talk about sort of like Jeff Bezos and working in Amazon, you know what you're getting there. It's kind of like it says it on the tin, right?
Yeah. What was it
You
like?
mentioned
Oh.
I know,
you mentioned like
Justin, you have complex feelings there.
We all have complex
yeah.
feelings.
Autumn was there too. It was a lot of like. I mean, I worked directly under Deepak for quite a while, so yeah. We You mentioned early on, like doing going Kubernetes was a shift from GCE of like you were kind of having a hard time making changes and you wanted to change the industry. Do you think that the things that you set out to do were successful? Like not just the technology implementations, but like, you know,
Yeah, no, I think Kubernetes was very successful that way. Oh, you were asking what would I have done differently? Oh, we dropped that thread. I think eventually, Brendan started playing around with third-party resources, which eventually became CRDs.
CRDs. Yeah.
And I think I understood sort of in an intuitive way the power of having a clean API, and so the original API definitions was stuff that I did uh, uh, based off of knowledge from doing the GCE API, which I spent a lot of time on, which is based off of knowledge of looking at AWS and OpenStack and stuff like that. And so, understanding the power of a clean API, I think was something we got right in Kubernetes. I wish we had understood the power of CRDs, what eventually third-party resources eventually became CRDs, and this idea of having sort of a, domain independent API core that was, I think, if we could go through and extract all of the sort of the container stuff out of Kubernetes core
Yeah.
and have the API server be pure, kind of like what is it, the KCP project type of stuff.
Yeah.
I think like that would have been a better way to go, but I think we had to learn to get there, you know?
Yeah, Tim often talks about like I wish pods weren't a first party thing in Kubernetes, right? Like if we could just have here's the API, implement whatever you want, makes it a little more flexible. Right now, we feels like we're shoehorning a lot of things like KCP and cross-plane and those sorts of things. We're like we like the API, we like the predictability of this API and being able to do CRUD actions off of here, store my stuff for me.
Yeah, the
Um,
controller pattern and
yeah,
the spec versus status, all those patterns I think have served us well. But yeah.
What are you most
Um,
proud of?
um, I mean the community, honestly, right? I think so there was a tricky point in Kubernetes history where early on I mentioned it was essentially a bunch of low ego engineers that are like, okay, we just got a lot of stuff to get done. Let's get the work done, right? And there was enough excitement that everybody and their brother came in and wanted to add stuff to Kubernetes, add features like, and figuring out what to say no to, what to say yes to, how to create rooms for people to extend, all that stuff was really difficult. And we recognized at some point that we didn't have a governance structure that was well defined. And it was really just sort of by osmosis and sort of influence. Um, and through that, we wanted to actually get more formal. And so eventually that process led to things like the steering committee and SIGARCH and like some of the other sort of like, processes that are still being used today. But at the time, we were in charge because we were kind of the ones in charge, but we wanted to actually sort of slip in this governance structure without alienating the community. And so we had a set of meetings that we called the sort of the steering bootstrap committee or something like that, where, governance bootstrap, where there were a set of us that are like, okay, what does good governance look like? How do we actually do this? How do we actually? And so I think being able to define that and get people on board without people freaking out and abandoning the project. I think all that has led to a lot of Kubernetes longevity over time. And I'm proud of the fact that, like, hey, we've handed that off to new people and they've taken it on. And there's been ups and downs and things that have worked and not worked. But I think the fact that the set of people leading the project now weren't the set of people leading the project at the
yeah.
beginning, I think is a healthy thing. I think
It,
the BDFL, the benevolent dictator for life thing, is almost an anti-pattern, at best, very difficult to do right, at
yeah.
at worst, an anti-pattern, and I think we avoided that, and I'm really proud of that.
How core was CNCF formation to like CNCF was before the governance pieces, right? This is just a neutral legal body essentially.
The relationship between Kubernetes and the CNCF has always been complicated. The LF at the end of the day is a marketing organization, it's a trade association, and their goal, is to boost their members, which are the people who are paying dues to the organization. And the goal of the Kubernetes project is the Kubernetes project. And so there are
Yeah.
times where these things are at odds. And I wish that there was more transparency from the CNCF and the LF in general around budget and who's like where the money's going and how it's being spent. And it's just not there. That being said, I think having a neutral place for this stuff to exist from a legal point of view, from a trademark, and I have issues with the way the unevenness they've enforced some of the trademark policies too. But when you look at this stuff, I think that having places where companies can come together and collaborate and having some sort of neutral ground is incredibly important. I think that was a big part of Kubernetes success also. But I think, that's the governance sort of predated anything with like the CNCF and the TOC actually deciding sort of, okay, at this point that, the CNCF is like, if you want to be graduated, you have to have some governance, right? But it's like, I think, we were really
Yeah.
sort of making up as we went along, I think a little bit. And I think it's worked out well. I'm proud of that work. I think other stuff that I'm proud of that I did is I started off the whole KEP process. At some point, I'm like, okay, a lot of stuff is changing. The
It's
project's
the
mature enough
Kubernetes
where
enhancement proposals
yeah.
for
Yeah,
sure.
and so you look at things like, JEPs in Java and PEPs in Python, and I'm like, we need something similar where it's time to have a little bit more process around how do we add new features and make changes. There were a lot of people that were resistant to that because they were used to just making stuff up and checking it in and going, but I think in terms of looking at it from the point of view of the user community, having those signals of what's happening and having some of that sort of documentation over time, I think has played out pretty well.
I think processes are one of the underrated parts of engineering. Like writing code is cool, but having a structured way to like work together is really important.
And making that process, not only have longevity, but also have, like, a larger scale in just who can be involved is, like, a
Yeah.
huge thing for a lot of the stuff where whoever had commit rights decided it was a good idea is not the, not the way to go.
No, not for a
Yeah, and I
sustainable
think
community.
yeah, and there's no one size fits all, right? For what works for a small project or for one project may not work for another project, and so I think it's there's so many of these problems where as engineers we want to be like, here's the one true solution to this, and there is no one true solution to so many
Yeah.
problems.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's why the words "it depends" is so popular.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Joe, this has been great. Thank you so much for giving us the time. We're gonna have you back so we can
Yeah,
Please do.
figure out
anytime, let me
from
know.
Seriously, please come
day
back.
two day two Kubernetes stuff. We got Heptio stuff. I want to hear all your
Do you
thoughts on
have any,
platform
like,
engineering
one
and
cool,
AI.
like, Kubernetes, like, story or something crazy that happened with the original p not doesn't have to be bad crazy, but, like, a cool memory you have from building Kubernetes or working with
I
it?
remember we knew we were okay, so two things I'm gonna finish with. So, um, I ended up leaving Google because I didn't see a career ahead there for me, right? So I launched Kubernetes and I got a 3.0 on my next review, which was essentially telling me that, like,
What?
No
I'm not on
way.
track to getting I was a senior staff engineer, I'm not on track to getting to principal. And so
Wow.
that's pretty much, that
What
started the
exactly did
process
Wow.
they
of me
want?
leaving
Your,
Google.
like, firstborn child, a kidney? Like, what did they
Well,
want for principal?
there were a lot of people that, like, when we were launching, there's one marketing guy's like, it's like, "I know there's a unicorn in there somewhere because I see a lot of unicorn shit, but I don't know what it is." Like, they just did not understand it because they didn't understand the relationship to the business. Because again, systems thinker, right? I'm
Yeah.
like, look, if Google can actually go through and do something where for every new user onto technology X, Google gets 80% and Amazon gets 20, that 20% of Amazon, like it may still be larger in numbers, but like, in terms of Amazon doing stuff, right? But like Google's, if they're grabbing more than their fair share of new users based on technology, that's a win over time for Google. And that's the way you think about eating away at markets over time.
Unless
It's
you're Azure and you just try to give it away for free.
yeah,
So
I mean,
it's
well, there's different ways that you can do this, right? Where you can
yeah.
essentially
Yeah.
But
so
I
open
love
source
that
and
you're such a
Kubernetes was a
big
way to sort of
picture
what's that? I'm
thinker.
sorry?
I love that you're such a big picture thinker, like, that's so underrated, and I feel like
It's
people
not
get
always appreciated
it's
though.
not always appreciated, and I no, but I think it gets squished out of a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
Because we put so much premise on being technical and fitting these modes, like, I think that's really rad.
Yeah, so, like, yeah, that is kind of like so I think, there wasn't a lot of appreciation for Kubernetes early on at Google, and I think even over time, when you look at sort of the governance and the sort of the drama around donating things like Knative or Istio to the CNCF, um, Google wanted to hold on control because I think there were a lot of people that felt like they gave away too much with Kubernetes,
Yeah.
not recognizing that Kubernetes would not have been Kubernetes if not for the community, if not for everything that went into it.
Especially when you get that many people working together on one thing, like, it makes you more successful.
Yeah, and so I think it Google definitely didn't know what they had right after we launched it, and even over time, I think it's different leaderships rotating through saw in different ways. But the thing I'll leave you with is that the time that I knew that we were onto something is that I think it was Brendan and I were down in a bar in San Francisco, and we overheard San Francisco. We overheard somebody else in the bar talking about Kubernetes, and this was
Oh,
pretty
wow.
early on. You're
Yeah.
like, okay, maybe we're onto something when you overhear somebody else talking about your thing,
That's so
and
rad.
yeah, that was pretty crazy.
I hope the guy that or whoever that was in leadership who gave you that review and that didn't listen to you, I hope it, like, lives in their nightmares forever.
I don't know.
Like, Google lost such
Ours
a
is doing
cool
fine
thing
in New
in you.
Zealand.
Yours is fine. Yeah, this is. Wow. Oh, well, thank you so much, Joe. This was just fantastic. And again, we'll schedule another time because I want to hear the rest of these stories.
All
This is
right, yeah,
great.
we'll keep talking. It's so good to hang out with you guys, and I always enjoy doing these
Thank you
things.
so much for coming. I can't wait till part 2.
All right,
And thank
Talk
you
to y'all
everyone
later.
for listening, and we'll talk to you all next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fork Around and Find Out. If you like this show, please consider sharing it with a friend, a coworker, a family member, or even an enemy. However we get the word out about this show helps it to become sustainable for the long term. If you want to sponsor this show, please go to fafo.fm/sponsor and reach out to us there about what you're interested in sponsoring and how we can help. We hope your systems stay available and your pagers stay quiet. We'll see you again next time.